hope that everyone is constantly assessing when they have that fuck it moment. Is this a healthy fuck it or is this an unhealthy fuck it? And what do I need to do about it?
Hey y'all, thanks for joining us for another episode of 911 Delta, Tethered for Life. This podcast may not be suitable to all listeners due to language and subject matters. Please listen with care.
Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of 911 Delta, Tethered for Life podcast. We're your hosts, Casey and Anna. Backed by popular demand, we have Dr. Meredith Krause joining us tonight. So grab those headsets, let's talk. So, Bug, another week has gone by. Can't believe how time is flying by. My week was pretty busy and productive, so really no complaints. Spring has definitely sprung around this farm. Flowers and grass are growing like crazy, and the animals are frisky as fuck. How was your week?
Girl, my week has been wild. Grandma had her 100th birthday party on Sunday, which was all St. Patty's Day. And then we have this big kids consignment sale that Matt and I always volunteer at, and we always sell our crap at, and we always buy crap at. So, it's been a long week doing that. That's why the episode's a little late this week. Sorry, guys.
So last week we had Alicia on talking about hostile work environment and bullying in the workplace. We also shared a story from old Sheila discussing her encounters with some pretty shitty supervisors and coworkers as well. We want to thank both ladies for sharing their stories and Alicia for coming on. So, Bug, without further ado, we want to welcome back with us tonight Dr. Meredith Krause.
Okay, welcome y'all. Tonight we have Dr. Meredith back on with us to talk about burnout and compassion fatigue and how they are not the same thing. So welcome, Meredith.
Thank you for having me back. We're going to debunk some myths and misconceptions tonight about job-related stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, all the important stuff so that we can be speaking the same language.
Yay, because I think this is a big topic that always gets confused. And I also think that people don't understand that if you're suffering from one, then, like we talked about last time, your bucket's empty and you can't refill to deal with the other. So,
Right.
yeah. So people get confused. Like, I'm burnt out. Well, no, you're not. You might be burnt out. And then they confuse that with like post-traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. And it's like, no, you're just burnt out because of your job situation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is because of sloppy language. I think some of it is because researchers and psychologists and professionals haven't done a good job kind of clarifying the concepts and making them real and understandable for people. But the place where I actually like to start first is with the very word stress, because that is kind of one of my big pet peeves. And where I like to start in terms of debunking myths or misconceptions is attacking that word stress and understanding what it really means. So the way I look at pressure, the pressures we face as humans, is there is stress. Stress is simply the pressure that we face as organisms in the world. And stress is not necessarily good or bad. There are different kinds of stress, and we forget to use the right words for the types of stress we're facing. The word we never talk about is eustress, EUSTRESS. That's actually the good stress that helps us perform at our peak, that kind of challenges us to grow and bring our A game. To our work, to our hobbies, to our parenting, whatever it is. Eustress is something you never hear about. It's always stress, 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 stress. Well, that's not right either. It's distress, right? That's the bad stress. That's stress gone wrong, that takes us into the not so good realm of functioning that can undermine our performance in any aspect of our life. So when I'm working with people, I'm quick to say, hey, we're getting sloppy here. What kind of stress are we talking about? Is this the good stress that takes us out of the drone zone into the peak performance zone? Or is this sustained, unrelenting pressure at too high of an intensity for us to manage? And then we get into the red zone of distress. So that's the first, and people say, well, Meredith, why does this really matter? That's just words. No, I think it's really good to remember because we often lose sight of the fact that without healthy pressure, we become drones. We just zombie through life. We don't grow. We just survive. We don't thrive. We don't change. We don't learn. So that's the first one I want to throw out there to y'all. Does that kind of change the conversation at all?
I think so, yes. My brain always goes to as first responders, what do you need that stress, right? You need that stress to do your job. But when people talk about stress, it's always in the bad sense. And I think then people get stressed out about talking about it because they think it's bad, but it's not all bad.
Yeah. And then the other thing this kind of wording does is it reminds us that each one of us has different thresholds for what is good stress, eustress, versus what is unmanageable distress. And that's also really important to remember when you're working in a team setting where maybe you, Anna, or you, Casey, you can take it all day long. You can just take a licking and keep on ticking, come back the next day after a good night's sleep or a good day's sleep, and you just get on and you're right back in that peak performance zone. That may not be the case for the person sitting next to you because of the way they're wired, because of the way they process and think about the pressures they're facing, because maybe they're consumed with other pressures, other stressors that are tapping into them, emptying their bucket for them. So I think that's the other reason why thinking about this stress as a continuum of good to better to not so good at all is really important because it helps us remind ourselves that everyone's different. So that's the first place to start. And then, I know that you guys are often wondering, so how bad does stress have to get for it to become post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And we have to remember that those concepts, they're diagnostic labels with very clear criteria that have been established by the professionals in the mental health field. And a lot of people say, well, I got PTS or I got PTSD. And there again, the sloppy language kind of drives me nuts, because just because you've had a crappy day or you've been exposed to a traumatic incident doesn't mean you have PTSD, that you meet those diagnostic criteria for a disorder. The other thing I always like to tell people is for a disorder to be a disorder, it has to adversely impact you, right? There has to be a negative impact on your emotions, on your functioning, on your life, on your relationships, on a combination of those factors. So that's why it's real important to get the language straight from the beginning.
That brings up a question for me that I think might come up for a lot of people is in the research that I've done, it seems like there's a lot of people that will sometimes mistake anxiety disorder or anxiety issues with post-traumatic stress. And they're not the same. So how do you think, how do you make the difference there between, oh, I'm just having an anxiety issue, or am I really having a post-traumatic stress problem?
Well, the biggest distinguishing factor is you must have direct exposure to the traumatic event, right? So it either has to happen to you or you have to witness it firsthand, right? So that's the big issue. Many people with anxiety disorders, panic disorder, they develop that set of symptoms in the absence of traumatic exposure. So, number one, there has to be a trauma there. Number two, the distinguishing thing about PTSD is that by virtue of having been exposed to that trauma, you experience lasting, persistent, and maladaptive changes in the way you approach the world, in the way you process your emotions, and the way you think about life. Okay. It has to have been such a mind-blowing experience. Remember, we talked about that during our last time together. We talked about what happens when our reality and our core beliefs collide in a way that doesn't make sense. Well, trauma can do that. And if you can't make sense of your experience and accommodate your core beliefs to them, then you experience these changes in the way you look at the world. The world becomes unsafe. You might develop kind of new and different beliefs about other humans, about relationships, about sex, about, whatever the trauma entailed, driving your car, getting on a plane, going out at night alone after dark. So fundamental changes in the way you think, fundamental changes in the way you behave, things like avoiding certain situations, being triggered to the point of distress by even thinking about situations, or re-experiencing those situations in your waking hours or in your sleep, persistent nightmares. Another thing can be dissociation, where you lose chunks of time because you just check out at the thought of the trauma or at some reminder of the trauma. So changes in your thoughts, changes in your emotions, changes in your body. So persistent arousal, being easily startled, being on edge, not being able to calm down enough to go to sleep. It's that whole constellation of ugliness and discomfort that really makes PTSD a complicated, significant mental health challenge. Different, and not that other anxiety disorders aren't complicated and difficult. It's just we've got this total package of behavioral changes, cognitive changes, and emotional changes to deal with. And they have to persist for more than a month to meet that criterion set.
Interesting.
Does that
And I
help?
think,
That is
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. And I think too, like people think that when you say like the trauma has to be, it has to be a mind-blowing experience. Not everybody, but like someone who maybe handles stress well is like, well, then it's got to be some big event, right? Like it's got to be some devastating thing. But for somebody else, or maybe somebody who's exposed to like constant repeated traumas of the same type, like they could be small and just add up, right? Or what maybe traumatizes me, like you said in the beginning, may not traumatize Casey or vice versa. And I think that's the other thing is, when I look at the programs that are out there for first responders in general, but dispatchers for sure, it's all about this critical incident, this one big thing. And I'm like, for a lot of people, that's not the thing that does them in, right? It's the repeated distress or that burnout thing.
Well, and I was going to say, yeah, and in that case, because you're not being exposed firsthand, you're not experiencing the traumatic event. This is where we get it into the land of burnout and compassion fatigue, right? Where just by virtue of the nature of our work, we're put at risk for these kinds of adverse outcomes. So should we jump in to kind of what is burnout? What is compassion fatigue? Or do we have more questions about PTSD, how often it happens, why it doesn't happen to some people, why, any of those kinds of questions?
How often does it happen? Is it more frequent in first responders rather than the general population?
Let's put it into context. So we've done some pretty good studies of the prevalence of PTSD in the general population. And we know that 6% of the US population at some point in their lives will meet criteria for PTSD or have a PTSD diagnosis. 6%. So that's a sizable chunk. In some countries, that number is much, much higher just by virtue of the strife or difficulties that are taking place. But in America, it's about 6%. Now, when we start kind of drilling down into what does that mean, when we look at dispatchers, I've found one or two studies that look at the prevalence of job-related PTSD in dispatchers. We're seeing about 13 to 15% of dispatchers reporting symptoms that would meet criteria for PTSD. Okay, that number is pretty consistent with the dum-dums out on the street, as you guys call them. They're my pet population, so I'd never call them dum-dums, but officers, firefighters, those folks running between 15, 20%. Okay. Which, given that you're at much greater exposure than the general population, it would make sense that the risk is higher. The reason I get really concerned and the numbers that really kind of put me on edge is suicide risk. And PTSD and suicide are not directly related. If you get PTSD, it doesn't mean you're going to engage in suicidal behavior or experience suicidal thoughts. But we know that the risk of suicide in all first responders is 10 times higher than in the general population. And that speaks to a separate and much more complicated issue that I don't think we have time to talk about tonight. But what we see is first responders generally are running kind of at or below, the averages for trauma exposed people, but there's something going on that's putting them at much greater risk for suicide. Okay. And I think, like I said, that's a complicated discussion I'd love to get into, but not tonight. Now, the other thing we need to do is consider, okay, what percentage? So we know 6% of the US population develops PTSD at some point in their lives. We know that dispatchers are running between 13 and 15%. Okay. Question becomes, what percentage of people who experience a trauma develop PTSD? That's a very important question to ask, because if you watch TV or the movies, you're going to assume that number is what? What would you guys guess? What percentage of people who experience a rape, combat trauma, line of duty shooting or death, what percentage of people would you guess, just based on what you see in the media, would develop PTSD?
100%.
Yeah. all the way around.
In fact, much lower, man. Only 15% of trauma exposed folks develop PTSD.
Wow.
And that is something that we do a terrible job educating folks about. And what that tells us is about 70 to 85% of people actually experience what we call post-traumatic growth. They come out, they're able to process and make sense of this trauma. They're able to accommodate and adjust their core beliefs about the world to make sense of it. They plug into support. They get validation, affirmation, hope. They learn more about themselves, and they come out of it, out of this trauma, stronger, better, and more self-aware than when they went into it. Symptom-free. It's a testament to how resilient we are as humans when we're provided with the right kind of support. And we're not buffeted by another trauma, Anna, which is what, you brought up a very important point. And segments of our population in America, the marginalized, the poor, those living in disadvantage, economic disadvantage, have that kind of repeated trauma exposure that really interferes with their ability to experience that post-traumatic growth. And that too is another issue that we could spend hours talking about. That's heartbreaking and challenging. But for many of us, post-traumatic growth is the outcome. And you can think back on your own life. The worst thing you've ever been through, and you guys don't need to tell me. If you hadn't been able to process it, you might have gotten stuck in PTSD, but something got you through it, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I don't think anybody has ever talked about that in any, course or whatever that I've ever taken. Yeah, never. And I think that is really important, because I think people that experience that post-traumatic growth, you sometimes get a feeling of guilt, or like, why am I not fucked up? I should be fucked up. All my friends are fucked up. I should be fucked up, right? You are not. And then people are telling you, and this is why I really dislike like those critical incident debriefing things. But, because people are telling you, well, it's okay to feel this way, and it's okay to feel that way, and it's okay. Okay, well, is it okay to feel okay? Like, like I don't mean to be the asshole in the back, but like,
and that's why, I think I went to CISD training, the critical incident stress debriefing training back in the 90s. And it was really kind of early aughts that it fell out of favor for that very reason, that we were pathologizing or focusing on the negative of trauma,
right.
telling people how they should be feeling, forcing them to engage in this group encounter when that may not be the right thing for people. Sort of like forced fun in the job, right, where you have to go out and have fun together or do team building. No, not me. I'm not one of those people. I don't do forced fun. I wouldn't want to do forced treatment.
We called it mandatory family fun when I was growing up.
Mandatory. Yes, you will have fun. And that's why we moved to more of a peer support model, which is we have these trained peers who can at least be validating and connect you to what you might need or want, and make it more of a voluntary, as needed support. And I do feel for the places where I see them still using CISD, and everyone has to sit there in a circle and kumbaya, and I'm just like, oh no.
Right.
So, but the post-traumatic growth thing is real, and I've seen it, and I'm amazed at people. I mean, just this week I was doing an interview with an exceptional 30-year-old amazing member of the armed services, and we spent an hour and a half talking about why he wants to take a promotion. And I started going through some of his psych testing, and I said, I've got this interesting question here that says that you occasionally are reminded by a horrible thing that happened to you. What's that all about? And his face kind of went slack, and he said, I was a twin. And that's when my stomach tends to hit the bottom of my chair, because I know there's a bad story coming. He watched his twin sister get murdered as a 15-year-old.
Wow.
And this man has overcome that. He is a case study in resilience and post-traumatic growth, and he's doing great things for America. And yes, he still is reminded of her. Yes, it's still a painful reminder, but on the whole, he good, right? And I see it all the time in candidates for dispatch positions. I see it often, very frequently in police candidates. That's why they're inspired to do it, right? Because they
Right.
had that cop that was there for them in their hour of absolute need, and they want to be that person for someone else. Or they had to call when their mom was ODing to 911, and that dispatcher talked them through their watching their mom die. I mean, of course they'd want to do that job. And post-traumatic growth allows them to do it. Now, you might say, then what happens to the 15% that doesn't? That's when people get stuck. And I actually talk about in treatment with folks with the PTSD about identifying your stuck points. And stuck points are those core beliefs we just can't make sense of given our experience. And then it becomes a very kind of practical exercise in rethinking the way we tell our story of that trauma so that we can make sense of it, put it in perspective and contextualize it, and get unstuck from it so that we no longer have to be kind of held hostage by that trauma, which is what happens when you're stuck and you can't go certain places and you can't think about certain things and you can't do certain things and you withdraw from the world and you're on edge and hyper aroused and you just want to come out of your skin, right? That's that stuck point. So let's focus on the post-traumatic growth and how we cultivate it in ourselves and in our peers or in our subordinates or people out on the streets.
Well, I'm already in tears. Like this shit is like
No, that was not my intent, Casey.
no, it's a good thing. That's why I'm sitting here so quiet because last time you were on, I kind of left Bug hanging because I was so mesmerized at everything. And whew. So if I'm sitting here not saying much, it's not a bad thing.
Well, when you were talking about that, I was thinking this is why it's so important for people to know their own bodies, their own brains. I think I was fortunate. Like my parents, I think, did a pretty good job of kind of teaching us these things. I don't know how they did it. I don't know. Maybe it's genetic. I have no idea. But I know that there are a lot of people out there who have no idea what, good stress and bad stress and how their body reacts to something. And like, if I feel this, it means that I'm scared shitless, or if I feel this, I'm angry, or, and that's going to pass, but I gotta feel it first. And I think schools are I think they're starting to kind of build that into curriculum now. Because I see that with my guys, some of the stuff on the thing, and I'm like, wow, we were never taught that in school. Like, So I think that's good. But as adults, and I had to do this in my life, I've had to do this a couple of times, was readjust those core beliefs. And the first time you have to do it, it's really freaking hard because you feel like those core beliefs were like, I don't know, bequeathed to you from somewhere more powerful than thee, and you're stuck with them.
And they define you and they make you they define you, they keep you safe, they make you whole, and they're irrefutable, and if you take one away, it's like the key part of the Jenga puzzle, right? The whole fucking thing's going to come and go crashing to the ground if we take one of those. Or I'm defective. Everyone else seems to just go through the world. I just must be a fuck up, or I must be defective, or I must be a loser, or I'm stupid, or I'm gullible, or I'm worthless, or I can't get things straight. All these kind of messages that the itty bitty shitty committee tells us about what it means to have to make these adjustments, right?
Right. Because, and I think nobody tells you that. I mean, I had, so when I was in high school, I had an awesome psychology teacher. And so she always, like, always just, I've always been interested in it after taking her classes, right? And so I took some more classes as electives in college. And then when I went through my divorce, like that was a huge freaking core belief you got to change, right? And talk about feeling like shit. I mean, oh my God. Well, when I met with a psychologist that was supposed to be marriage counseling, and well, that didn't go. Um, he's like, you can change that thought. And I'm like, no, I can't. Like, it's the one that I was given. And so it's so important to like tell people, just because you came into this thinking that everyone was great. Like, it was so funny on my own social media page yesterday. We had a lot of brush fires in the area, and there was someone who career dispatcher, career firefighter, and he's like, all these stupid people causing these burns. And there was another person who is not a first responder at all, regular, civilian. And she's like, most of them were caused by down power lines or something, not stupid people. And I'm like, right there, like two core beliefs that are totally opposite. We live in the same world, right? And I thought it was so funny because that is so true. And it's hard to change those beliefs, but you can do it. And then in that particular context, you have to know, like, that's one core belief. Like, okay, everybody's not good, right? Law. Like, there's not everybody has good, okay? But not everybody is terrible either. And as a first responder, that's a really hard thing to continually remind yourself that there is so much good out there, because you see the bad, you live in a continual shit show, and you don't realize that you're only dealing with like 1% of the population, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
your job is basically like you're in charge of power washing the dumpsters. You
right.
never get to water the garden, right? So, yeah, you're going to think the world is a shitty, smelly dumpster if that's all you're ever asked to do. But yeah, there is a whole other world out there.
Yeah.
I also believe in this funny thing called mastery through repetition. I think the universe has a very funny sense of humor. And I believe that each one of us has a lesson to learn in life.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes it's related to what we believe about the world, how the world should be, how the people should be. It's always the shoulds. And
Mm-hmm.
and I believe the universe will give us endless opportunities to get our shit straight and to unshould our thinking, and untwist our thinking. And until we do, we'll keep kind of getting smacked in the face by that experience. So, and I think each one of us has to reflect on, what are my recurrent battles?
Mm-hmm.
Or what are my pet peeves? And why do they bug me? Or why do I always get worked up about that? Or I always make an ass of myself. Or I'm always worn out and I only last 18 months in any job, right? Or I only last 6 months in any relationship. That's repetition. So what are we trying to master? So the example I gave is, I'm a recovering perfectionist. You might not agree, Anna, that I'm recovering at all, but I believe I'm recovering. And so one of my shoulds was, I should be selfless, work hard, take care of people, and be planful, organized, and self-disciplined. And if I do those things, everything will be okay. All right. And you can imagine what my life was like. I believed I had to be good at everything. I had to work hard. I could never say no. Whatever my boss asked, I'd deliver on time or ahead of time at a level of perfection. And it didn't matter. I mean, I kept grinding through, couldn't stay at a job because I was getting burned out. Fortunately, I was able to stay in some relationships, which was nice, but constantly feeling like, oh Lord. And it wasn't until I was pushing both of my parents in wheelchairs, one on each hand, into the oncology ward that I realized, no, it doesn't matter how hard I work, how selfless I am, how much I take care of people, bad shit is going to happen. And I can't control that. And that's when I broke physically, emotionally. I broke. And the world took me to my knees. And I think all of us have had that moment where we've been brought, and if you haven't, you will. I say that to young
Just
people
wait.
when they look at me like I'm a bitter old woman. And I'll joke and say, oh, you're sweet. Life hasn't broken you yet. Life will break you. Okay. Especially for women, because there are these unrealistic expectations about what we're meant to do and what we should be able to do, and how we should be these endless wells of caregiving and selflessness and sacrifice and juggling. Sooner or later, you get broken. So that was my moment of recovery where I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to rack and stack my priorities. I'm going to tell some people to piss off. I'm going to be honest and say no. And that's that renegotiation of your core beliefs and your behavior, right? But boy, it was hard. It took me probably 16, 20, 36 years. No, it's 42 years. 42 years of perfectionism. Hard.
You got to get to 40 before you're
before you done been broke.
Yeah. Right, before you've been broken good enough that you're figuring out how to fix it. I don't know, but
and this gets into the burnout thing, right? Because the other concept that I like to talk a lot about, and it's not because I like to use the F word, but it's because people get it when I talk to them this way. I'll often see people in my office that come in kind of low energy. I might get some feedback from their bosses or from their peers that, they don't really give a fuck. All right. And that might be a source of some concern. So I'm always trying to suss out, like, what's going on here? Is the person burned out? Are they no longer feeling engaged? Is their work no longer meaningful? Have they been chewed up and spat out? Or is there something else going on? So oftentimes I'll ask the person, okay, here's what I need to figure out with you, and you help me. I believe there are basically two kinds of fuckets. There's a healthy case of the fuckets where you say, I can't control that. I can't do anything about it. Fuck it, I'm not going to get upset about it, right? That for me is healthy fuckets. You acknowledge the limits of your power and control, and you sort of say, I'm not hitching my emotional horse. I'm not draining myself of my energy. I'm not giving into that temptation. Fuck it. That gets the thumbs up from me. I'm all for that kind of fuck it. I also have the fuck you, fuck this, fuck that job, fuck that call, fuck that guy on the phone, fuck all y'all. Those are the unhealthy fuckets. Okay. And people start having that same chuckle.
I know. I'm pretty sure that at one point in my life, fuck all y'all was like, was my key phrase.
Well, and that is the barometer of burnout or compassion fatigue. We got to figure out which one, right? But we call that in the profession apathetic withdrawal, where we no longer care and we're trying to figure out how to back up the truck and get the fuck out of Dodge, either mentally, physically, or with regard to our performance. And we all know, and we've all seen it, we might have even experienced it ourselves, where you get to that point of just, I'm done. I can't care. I don't want to care. I have nothing left to give. I'm broken and I really, really resent you all or this place or whatever. Now, the real dangerous place of that, where that can really cross over into the danger line is with excessive force complaints in first responders. In the military and intelligence settings, it's insider threat, where they engage in sabotage, espionage, or other acts against people, the United States, that kind of thing. So this is no laughing matter. Apathetic withdrawal is really, really important, but also suicide risk. Okay. And feeling so depleted and having so little to give that just not waking up in the morning would be the preferable outcome. So I hope that everyone is constantly assessing when they have that fuck it moment. Is this a healthy fuck it or is this an unhealthy fuck it? And what do I need to do about it?
Okay, guys, I decided to stop the episode here so you would get it faster because there is like another whole episode behind it. And if I get to editing that, it's going to take me longer to get the episode out to you. So I'm going to drop this one. Stay tuned next week for part 2.
So in close, guys, I just want to give a couple shout out to all the folks who participated in our tea time questions. Those folks are a Jonathan Bullman, Brandy Lynn, Andy Max, Jenny Bellevue, Brittany Queenbee LeBarrier, I'm sure I pronounced that incorrect and I apologize, Briley Blaylock, Kim Cascady, Mark Hewson, Gina Michelle, Joy Willis, Tim Prue, Austin Schreier, Brooke James, Christine Forget, Kevin Rickens, JC and Dee Dee Holker, and Keith Deshaeus and Kyle Goodnight. We appreciate you guys so much and be looking out for some more questions this coming week. And shout out also to all the area who had to fight all these different fires yesterday with all this freaking wind. Thank you guys so much for all that you do, and I hope everybody was safe.
Yes, those brush fires the other day were crazy around Virginia, and I have to shout out to the Rappahannock County dispatcher who answered the phone over the radio because, girl, I have done that so many times in my life. You guys did an amazing job handling all that traffic. I enjoyed listening to it. And that one slip up just made my entire day because I'm like, yes, I'm not alone in the world. So thank you for that.
Calm Week is coming up in a few weeks, guys. We are going to have our first giveaway coming up. We will have details on that next week. So stay tuned for that. And until next time, y'all. Bye.
Bye.
And I think it's a testament to the fact that early in your service, you have to very quickly adapt to the fucked up nature of what you're being asked to do. And if you can't make that adaptation and make those changes to your core beliefs, like I said, adjust your expectations, adjust your approach, you leave.